Did you know that Miyamoto Musashi won every single duel he fought, even though he faced some of the most skilled warriors of his time? His unbeaten record wasn't just a matter of physical skill, it was the result of a powerful mindset, unparalleled strategy, and an understanding of his opponents that set him apart from everyone else. In this video, we'll uncover the key reasons why Musashi never lost a duel and how you can apply these lessons to your own life, whether in business, personal challenges, or competitive situations. Stick with me till the end because the insights we'll explore today could be the difference between victory and defeat in your own battles. Let's dive into the mind of a true warrior. Reason number 1: exceptional swordsmanship and training. Miyamoto Musashi's reputation as an undefeated swordsman isn't just some fabled part of his legend. It's grounded in his exceptional swordsmanship and relentless dedication to training. Musashi didn't just pick up a sword and get good at it, he devoted himself to mastering the craft with a kind of focus and precision that very few can even fathom. Let's take a step back and look at what made his skills so extraordinary. Musashi was relentless, never satisfied with just being good enough. For him, mastery was a lifelong pursuit, something he never took for granted. He wasn't just practicing his moves in a standard way either. His training wasn't confined to the traditional methods of the time. Musashi had this raw, unyielding hunger for understanding the true nature of combat, and he put his entire being into studying the science of fighting. He understood that swordsmanship wasn't just about speed or strength. It was about reading your opponent, understanding timing, and feeling the rhythm of the battle. He was the type of person who didn't just spar with people, he analyzed the way they moved, the small changes in their posture, the way their muscles tensed. It was as though he had an innate sense of how to exploit an opening before it even appeared. One thing that set him apart was his ability to blend technique with instinct. He didn't just memorize moves like most students of the sword. He practiced them until they became second nature, until his body moved as if the sword was an extension of himself. This didn't come easily. He spent years honing his skills, day in and day out, pushing the limits of what a human body could endure and still function. His intense focus meant that, during duels, his blade wasn't the only thing that was sharp, his mind was, too. While others might have been consumed by fear, adrenaline, or the pressure of the moment, Musashi remained calm, almost detached from it all, like he could step outside himself and watch the battle unfold from a distance. This mental clarity came from years of refining not just his physical form, but his mental discipline. Training wasn't just about repetitions for Musashi, it was about getting in touch with the deeper elements of combat, the almost spiritual side. He didn't just practice his swordplay for the sake of getting better at duels. He practiced to get better at life, to understand the inner balance between mind and body, and to apply that knowledge when the stakes were high. When it came to swordsmanship, Musashi was obsessed with the idea of perfection through practice, which wasn't about making a single flawless move, but about continually improving and being prepared for the unpredictable nature of real-world fights. But let's be clear, exceptional swordsmanship isn't just about the physicality of wielding a weapon. It's about understanding the environment and adapting to it. Musashi's training was full of experiments, of pushing boundaries. He wasn't the type to stick to a rigid style or convention. When he faced an opponent, he didn't just bring his techniques to the table, he brought his entire understanding of the world around him. He understood that swordplay wasn't just something done on a flat, predictable battlefield, it could be in a cramped room, on uneven terrain, or in a tense moment where you could hear every breath. Musashi's adaptability made him dangerous in every situation. Moreover, it wasn't just about practicing with a single sword. Musashi became known for wielding two swords at once, a style that was both innovative and fearsome. His training wasn't just limited to traditional forms, he was always looking for new ways to adapt and innovate. In his mind, the sword wasn't just a tool, it was a tool that could be shaped and used in limitless ways. So, what made his training truly exceptional wasn't just his physical ability, it was his mindset, his willingness to adapt and evolve, and his obsessive drive to perfect not just his techniques but his understanding of combat on a deeper level. Musashi's swordsmanship was never static. It was fluid, ever-evolving, and absolutely unstoppable. That's why he never lost a duel, because for him, swordsmanship wasn't about defeating his opponents, it was about constantly becoming better than himself. Reason number 2, continuous self-improvement. Miyamoto Musashi wasn't just a legendary swordsman because he could swing a katana with precision or outlast opponents with sheer stamina. No, the key to his undefeated record in duels lay in something more subtle but infinitely more important: his relentless pursuit of self-improvement. It wasn't a single moment or victory that defined him. It was a mindset. Musashi's story is a reminder that mastery in any field, whether it's martial arts, business, or even personal growth, is less about what you know at any given moment and more about how deeply you're willing to dig into your own potential, always striving for more. You see, Musashi didn't simply train for the duels he was facing at the time. He trained for the duels that he couldn't predict, the ones that might appear in the future, with opponents who were just as eager to grow and learn. What set him apart wasn't just his skill at wielding a sword, but his awareness that improvement had no endpoint. The moment you think you've learned everything there is to know, you've already started to fall behind. What's fascinating is that Musashi understood that real growth didn't happen when things were easy. It happened in those tough moments when you were pushed to the edge, when you had to figure out how to adapt, how to face the unknown. He didn't wait for perfection, he worked through imperfection, learning from each small failure and every time he stumbled. It was in those moments of struggle that he found the most valuable lessons. And here's the thing, Musashi wasn't just sharpening his sword skills or his ability to strategize. He was constantly evolving his mindset. He knew that the real battle wasn't against the other person standing in front of you, it was against your own limitations. The idea that you can be perfect at something right now? He rejected that. Instead, he focused on constant growth. Every day, there was something new to learn, something that could be refined, something that could be improved. You can almost imagine him in the midst of a long training session, sword in hand, sweat dripping down his face, not thinking, "I've done enough today." Instead, he would have been thinking about how to turn his weaknesses into strengths, how to find that next level of efficiency, that next small improvement in his technique. That drive is what made him not just a good swordsman, but a living example of continuous self-improvement. What makes Musashi's approach so powerful is that it doesn't stop with technical skills. It applies to every aspect of life. Whether it's your emotional resilience, your ability to communicate, or the way you manage your energy, there's always something you can improve. It's about becoming better, not just at the things you're good at, but also at the things that challenge you, the things that force you to grow. Musashi's method wasn't about becoming the best in any specific moment. It was about becoming better than you were yesterday. And that's where the real power lies, not in mastering everything all at once, but in knowing that there is always a path forward, no matter where you start or what you've already accomplished. Think about it. Every time Musashi faced an opponent, he wasn't just testing his skill against theirs. He was testing his own growth. Each duel was a measure of how far he had come. And that's what made him unstoppable, not that he was untouchable, but that he was always one step ahead, constantly refining and evolving. That's why Musashi never lost a duel. It wasn't because he was born with some innate, unbeatable skill, it was because he was always getting better. Reason number 3, mastery of strategy and psychological warfare. When we talk about Miyamoto Musashi's undefeated record in duels, we can't just focus on his swordsmanship. Sure, his skill with a blade was unmatched, but the real secret to his success lies in something much deeper, his mastery of strategy and psychological warfare. Musashi wasn't just fighting with his sword, he was fighting with his mind, his understanding of his opponents, and his ability to manipulate the situation before the first strike was even made. At the heart of Musashi's approach was his ability to anticipate what his opponents would do, sometimes before they even knew themselves. It's like a chess player who sees 10 moves ahead while their opponent is just focused on getting through the next one. Musashi understood that combat, at its core, wasn't just about skill or strength, it was about controlling the flow of the encounter. The moment he stepped into a duel, he was already strategizing multiple moves in advance, reading the environment, and gauging his opponent's mindset. This gave him a massive psychological edge before the fight had even begun. Now, this isn't just about outthinking someone on a battlefield. It's about knowing exactly what kind of pressure to apply at the right moments to break someone mentally. Musashi wasn't afraid to use subtle psychological tactics to make his opponent doubt themselves, question their abilities, or second-guess their next move. He understood that a fight wasn't just about physical strikes, it was about creating an atmosphere of uncertainty, discomfort, and hesitation. When you've got someone questioning themselves in the heat of battle, their ability to focus on their own moves deteriorates, and that's when they become vulnerable. He also had an incredible ability to adapt to the psychological state of whoever he was facing. Some opponents needed a little push, an insult, a taunt, something to get under their skin so they'd rush into a fight without thinking. Others were more patient and strategic, needing to be met with a cool, almost indifferent demeanor to frustrate them into making mistakes. Musashi could read these cues, and instead of fighting everyone the same way, he would tailor his approach to exploit his opponent's mental weaknesses. That's next-level strategy, knowing not just how to fight someone, but how to make them fight you on your terms. But it wasn't just about making them doubt themselves, it was about controlling the rhythm of the fight. The moment Musashi stepped onto the battlefield, he became the one setting the pace. He was constantly adjusting, constantly moving, creating an unpredictable flow that his opponents couldn't keep up with. Musashi didn't let his enemies dictate when the action would happen, he controlled when things were fast, when they were slow, and when the fight would end. This control over tempo gave him a clear advantage, especially when his opponents were accustomed to their own rhythm being disrupted. Let's also talk about his mastery of misdirection. One of the most powerful tools Musashi had in his arsenal wasn't just his sword, it was his ability to mislead his opponents into thinking they knew what he was going to do next. Musashi often used his physical movements, body language, and positioning to give off false signals, drawing his opponents into traps of their own making. He'd leave an opening, just enough for his opponent to think they had the upper hand, only to spring into action and take them by surprise. This subtle misdirection, a kind of baiting, made it impossible for his opponents to trust their instincts fully. And perhaps one of the most potent psychological tricks Musashi employed was his own calmness under pressure. Imagine facing an opponent who doesn't show any sign of fear, anxiety, or impatience. It's unnerving, right? That was Musashi, unshakable in his composure, no matter how intense the situation got. When you're staring down someone who's calm and focused, it's hard not to question your own readiness. That sense of stability is almost like a psychological fortress, making it nearly impossible for opponents to rattle him. And when people can't figure you out or make you flinch, they lose their confidence. It's a domino effect from there. In a world where most warriors focused on mastering their physical skills, Musashi understood that the mind was just as, if not more, important. It wasn't just about winning duels, it was about ensuring that his opponent was already defeated before the fight even began. And that, in essence, is the brilliance of his strategy and psychological warfare. Reason number 4, unconventional and adaptive fighting style. Miyamoto Musashi wasn't just a swordsman, he was a disruptor of traditions. His approach to combat wasn't about following the same old paths that others took. No, Musashi's style was as unpredictable as it was effective, and that's exactly what made him so dangerous. His ability to adapt in the heat of battle, to think on his feet and adjust in ways that others couldn't even imagine, is part of what made him nearly unbeatable. Musashi wasn't stuck in the past or tied down by rigid techniques. He was always innovating, always tweaking, and always willing to throw out the rulebook if it didn't serve him in the moment. What really sets Musashi apart in the world of sword fighting isn't just his skill with a blade, but his mindset. His whole approach to fighting was flexible, something that was practically unheard of in his time. Most warriors of his era trained in a very specific tradition, honing the same techniques over and over until they became second nature. But Musashi didn't care about tradition for tradition's sake. He understood that the battlefield, whether it was a literal one or a duel of wits, was never static. It was fluid, ever-changing, and required an adaptive, open-minded approach. One of the key elements of his style was his ability to shift between different stances, techniques, and even weapons without skipping a beat. Where other fighters would be locked into a single, predictable method of attack or defense, Musashi was constantly in motion, adjusting to whatever his opponent threw at him. This adaptability wasn't just about reacting to the immediate situation, it was about reading the moment, sensing where things were headed, and adjusting his approach before his opponent even realized what was happening. It wasn't uncommon for Musashi to use surprise and deception as part of his technique. While many warriors were focused on outmatching their opponent's physical strength or technical mastery, Musashi was focused on exploiting weaknesses in the mental game. He didn't just wait for openings, he created them. And he did it in ways that were so unexpected, his opponents often didn't know how to react in time. His unconventional approach meant that the usual strategies that worked against other fighters didn't work on him. It was like trying to catch smoke in your hands, it was never where you expected it to be. Musashi's dual sword style is a perfect example of his ability to think outside the box. Rather than just using the standard single sword that most warriors preferred, he wielded two, and not just for show. The concept wasn't new, but Musashi made it his own. He adapted the technique in ways that made his attacks faster and more unpredictable, forcing his opponents to fight on multiple fronts. Most fighters had their guard up against a single sword, but when Musashi came at them with two, they were forced to think twice before committing to an attack. It wasn't just the number of weapons that threw them off, it was the sheer inventiveness of how he used them. His opponents could never settle into a rhythm. They were constantly having to adjust to him, and that gave him the upper hand. But it wasn't just about weapons. Musashi's entire approach to combat was about making the fight work for him, not against him. He could fight in cramped spaces, on uneven ground, or under less than ideal circumstances and still come out on top. He understood that being predictable, or relying solely on physical strength, was a surefire way to get caught in a trap. Musashi was always looking for ways to exploit his environment, to bend it to his will and turn it into an advantage. His unconventional style wasn't just about what he did, it was about how he saw the world of combat as a dynamic, living thing that could be shaped and molded with the right mindset. The ability to adapt, to improvise, and to stay one step ahead of his opponent, this was the heart of Musashi's fighting style. He didn't rely on flashy techniques or forceful aggression. He relied on something much deeper, an intuitive understanding of combat, an ability to read his opponent's movements before they even made them, and a creativity that allowed him to find new ways of attacking and defending. Musashi never fought the same fight twice. For him, every battle was a new puzzle to solve, a new opportunity to innovate. And that's why, time after time, he walked away victorious. Reason number 5, unshakable mental fortitude. When you think of someone who's never lost a duel, it's easy to focus on their skills, their technical prowess, the way they move, their strategy. But here's the thing about Musashi, his success wasn't just about what he could do with his sword. It was about something far more important, something that can't be measured in physical strikes or quick reactions, his unshakable mental fortitude. Musashi had a mind that was as sharp as his blade, and it was this mental toughness that kept him ahead of his opponents, no matter the odds. Imagine standing across from someone, knowing that your life is on the line, that every move you make could be your last. That pressure? Musashi thrived under it. He didn't buckle. He didn't freeze up. He didn't let the weight of the situation crush him. Instead, he leaned into the pressure, using it as fuel. That's the power of mental fortitude. When everyone else is panicking or doubting, you stay calm, focused, and in control. You don't let fear dictate your next move. Musashi knew that mental fortitude wasn't something that could be built overnight. It wasn't about pretending you weren't afraid or ignoring the reality of danger. It was about training your mind to see beyond the immediate chaos and fear. He didn't just focus on sharpening his sword or perfecting his technique. No, he spent just as much time sharpening his mind. And this wasn't some mystical or abstract thing. It was about cultivating a mindset that allowed him to stay grounded, even when the world around him was anything but. When you're in a life or death situation, your mind can either be your greatest ally or your worst enemy. Musashi knew that if you let doubt creep in, even for a second, it could be over. Every time he faced an opponent, he wasn't just testing his sword skills. He was testing his mental toughness. Could he remain calm? Could he outlast his opponent mentally, even if they were better in terms of technique or speed? The answer, time and time again, was yes. Think about it, Musashi was often up against people who were more experienced, more skilled, or had better resources. But what they didn't have was that ironclad mental fortitude. They weren't used to the pressure, and it showed. Musashi, on the other hand, knew how to keep his head clear, to focus only on what mattered in the moment, blocking out everything else. That's the key difference between a winner and someone who falls short. It's not just about physical capability, it's about how you handle the mental game. And here's something that's even more crucial: mental fortitude isn't just about staying strong in moments of pressure. It's about resilience. It's about bouncing back when things don't go your way, about adapting when you're forced to change course. Musashi didn't win every duel in the way you might expect. He didn't always come out swinging, and he didn't always have the upper hand. But he never let a setback break him. If something went wrong, he adapted, adjusted his strategy, and carried on. This flexibility in his thinking, this refusal to let failure define him, is what made him unshakable. In fact, his entire approach to combat and life was built around this concept of resilience. Musashi wasn't afraid of loss, of mistakes, or of difficult challenges. He understood that these weren't roadblocks, they were opportunities to grow stronger. So when the odds were stacked against him, when he faced someone who seemed more prepared or more skilled, he knew that his ability to keep his head in the game, his unflappable determination, would make all the difference. This mental toughness didn't just help him in duels, it helped him in life. The strength of his mind was a huge part of his overall success. Musashi didn't shy away from conflict or struggle. He embraced it, knowing that the greatest challenges were often the best opportunities for growth. And that mindset? That was the secret weapon that no one could ever take from him. So, next time you think about Musashi's undefeated record, don't just think about his swordsmanship. Think about his ability to stay composed, to remain focused, to keep moving forward, no matter what. His mental fortitude wasn't something that could be shaken, it was his greatest asset, and it's why he never lost a duel. Reason number 6, battle-hardened experience. When we think of someone who never lost a duel, we often imagine a person who's just naturally gifted with a sword. But when it comes to Miyamoto Musashi, his success didn't come down to raw talent alone, it was his battle-hardened experience that set him apart. You see, Musashi wasn't just some guy who trained for a few years and called it a day. He spent his life in combat, and that kind of experience changes you. It shapes the way you think, how you move, how you handle pressure, and, most importantly, how you survive. First off, Musashi didn't simply study the art of combat, he lived it. He spent decades honing his skills in real-world battles, facing opponents who were just as skilled, if not more so. And it wasn't just one or two duels here and there. Musashi was in countless confrontations, each one a learning experience that brought him closer to perfection. By the time he faced his final duels, he wasn't just another swordsman, he was a seasoned warrior, able to anticipate and react with a level of precision that only comes from experience. Think about it, anyone can train in a dojo, hit a few targets, and practice stances. But there's no substitute for actual combat. It's a whole different world when you're facing someone who's not just trying to win but trying to kill you. In those situations, your body's natural instincts kick in. You can't afford to be hesitant. You can't second-guess your moves. Musashi understood this. His countless duels, each one more intense than the last, built up a level of instinct and reflex that made him nearly unbeatable. He had been through the chaos of battle enough times to know exactly how to keep his head, even when everything around him was falling apart. But it's not just about physical reflexes. Battle-Hardened experience teaches you something more subtle, the ability to read your opponent, to understand their every move before they even make it. In the heat of battle, most people focus on the immediate, what's happening right now, what's coming next. But someone like Musashi, with his vast experience, could read the smaller cues, the way someone shifted their weight, how they held their sword, the brief hesitation in their breath. These weren't things most people even noticed, but to Musashi, they were signs of what his opponent was thinking. In essence, his experience allowed him to get into their heads before the first strike was ever made. Another huge benefit of Musashi's experience was his ability to stay calm under pressure. Think about how we all react when things go sideways. We panic, we freeze, or we start making rash decisions. Now, imagine facing down an opponent who's trying to end your life. It's easy to imagine how a lot of people would falter in that moment, maybe rush in too soon or back off too late. But Musashi? He had been there before. Many, many times. The heat of the moment didn't rattle him. His mind remained clear, and his body responded in kind. That level of calmness, developed through years of being in life-or-death situations, is what separated him from others. When things got chaotic, Musashi stayed composed, and that composure gave him the edge. But experience doesn't just teach you how to fight, it teaches you when to fight. Musashi didn't charge into every battle head first. He understood the value of patience, of knowing when to wait for the perfect moment. His experience gave him an almost sixth sense about timing. He knew when to strike, when to feint, and when to hold back. This kind of timing doesn't come from reading books or watching others. It comes from being in countless situations where you had to learn the hard way what worked and what didn't. Musashi's experience made him so attuned to the rhythms of battle that he could almost predict the perfect moment to end a duel. There's also the mental toll of being constantly in conflict. Musashi wasn't just building physical skills, he was building mental resilience. The constant pressure, the constant threat of death, the weight of knowing that each duel could be his last, it all molded him into someone who could handle almost any challenge. While many would buckle under that pressure, Musashi thrived. His mental toughness, sharpened by years of combat, allowed him to stay focused and execute his strategies flawlessly. So, in the end, Musashi's undefeated record didn't come from being born a genius or possessing some supernatural talent. It came from years of hard-fought experience, each battle teaching him more about himself, his opponents, and the art of war. It wasn't just muscle memory or technical skill that made him invincible, it was the deep, hard-earned wisdom that came with being battle-tested time and time again. Musashi didn't just fight for victory, he fought for survival, and in the process, he became the master of it all. Reason number 7, superior understanding of distance and timing. When we talk about Miyamoto Musashi's skill, there's a certain magic that surrounds his understanding of distance and timing. It wasn't just that he could swing a sword with precision, it was his deep, almost instinctive grasp of the space around him, the perfect moments to strike, and the quiet power in choosing the right moment to move. Musashi had a way of controlling the tempo of a fight, and it was his timing that made him so dangerous. He wasn't the fastest, and he didn't rely on brute force. Instead, he mastered the art of being in the right place at the right time, sometimes before his opponent even knew what was about to happen. First off, let's talk about distance. Musashi understood it at a level that most fighters could never even hope to achieve. He didn't just know how far his opponent was, he felt it. It's like he could gauge the perfect range for each movement, almost like he had a sixth sense for it. At any given moment, Musashi would know the exact distance between him and his opponent, and more importantly, he'd know how to control it. If his opponent was too close, Musashi could easily sidestep or disengage. But if the distance opened up even a little, he'd exploit it. The beauty of his approach was how fluid it was. Distance wasn't something fixed in his mind, it was a dynamic, ever-changing factor in the fight. Musashi was always adjusting, stepping in or out, always keeping his opponent guessing. But it wasn't just about the physical space. It was about psychological distance, too. Musashi knew how to manipulate his opponent's sense of timing, making them second-guess their own movements. For example, he'd sometimes deliberately keep himself just out of reach, knowing that his opponent would be tempted to strike. And when they did, that's when Musashi would make his move. He wasn't rushing. He wasn't panicking. He was waiting, watching, letting his opponent's impatience become their downfall. Then comes timing. Timing in combat isn't just about speed, it's about knowing the exact moment to act. It's one of those things that can't be forced. Musashi's timing was surgical. He'd wait for the perfect opening, then strike with devastating precision. He didn't rush, and he didn't get eager. He knew that forcing the issue would just expose weaknesses. Instead, he'd move in and out of range, staying unpredictable, and waiting for that fraction of a second when his opponent's guard was down, or when their next move was too obvious. Musashi understood that timing wasn't just about waiting for the right moment, it was about creating that moment. Think about it, if you're facing someone who understands timing and distance on that level, you're already at a disadvantage. It's not enough to just be quick or strong. You could throw your best punch, but if Musashi has already read the distance, already understood your rhythm, he's going to be in the perfect position to evade or counter. It's like trying to catch the wind, it's always just out of reach. But it wasn't just that Musashi could evade attacks. He'd strike at the exact moment an opening appeared, making his attacks feel like they were a natural extension of his movement, not rushed or forced. That's the beauty of it. His timing wasn't about reacting, it was about choosing when and how to respond. But there's something else here that can't be ignored. Musashi didn't just time his own attacks, he timed his opponents. He studied their habits, their tendencies, their patterns. Every fighter has a rhythm. A good fighter can disrupt that rhythm, a great fighter can predict it before it happens. Musashi was great. He could sense a small shift in his opponent's body language, the way they were positioning themselves, and know exactly when they were about to strike. And in that moment, when they thought they had the upper hand, he'd either be gone or already in a position to strike. That's how he controlled the fight. Ultimately, Musashi's understanding of distance and timing wasn't just a physical skill, it was a mental one. He could anticipate what would happen, and then he'd create the conditions for it to unfold just the way he wanted. His mastery of distance and timing wasn't about playing defense or attacking on impulse. It was about being one step ahead, reading the battlefield with a kind of calm certainty that made him impossible to predict. His opponents couldn't adjust fast enough because Musashi's next move wasn't based on their actions, it was based on his understanding of what they would do, and when they would do it. And that's what made him unbeatable. Reason number 8, use of wooden weapons in fights. When you think of a sword fight, you probably picture two warriors locked in a deadly struggle, their blades clashing with sparks flying. It's intense, it's dramatic, and it's often a fight to the death. But here's where Musashi's approach to combat stands out from the rest. He didn't always rely on sharp steel in battle. Instead, he sometimes used wooden weapons, and not just as a training tool. This might seem odd at first, but there's a method behind this madness that played a huge part in his undefeated record. The beauty of using a wooden weapon, whether it was a bakken, a wooden sword, or a staff, was that it forced Musashi to rethink how he approached combat. A wooden sword doesn't cut or pierce like a real one, but it still packs enough of a punch to hurt. This subtle difference was exactly what made Musashi such a strategic thinker. When you train with something that's not as immediately dangerous, it pushes you to think about your attacks in different ways. It forces you to rely more on timing, precision, and positioning rather than brute force. Wooden weapons allowed Musashi to practice moves without the immediate fear of inflicting serious damage. He could test out new strategies, experiment with techniques, and learn the limits of his own body and mind without worrying about making a fatal mistake. But here's the real kicker: by using a wooden weapon, Musashi trained his mind to stay calm and composed, even in the heat of a battle. After all, it's one thing to strike with a weapon that can kill, it's another to strike with one that won't. That subtle shift in mindset allowed Musashi to stay focused on the long-term strategy, not just the immediate outcome of a single blow. There's another layer to this: wooden weapons are more forgiving. They don't break easily, and they don't chip or wear down the way a real sword does. This made Musashi's training sessions longer, more varied, and more consistent. He wasn't constantly worrying about the condition of his weapon, which gave him the freedom to focus entirely on the fight. It became less about the weapon and more about the warrior wielding it. But what's truly fascinating is how Musashi's use of wooden weapons extended beyond just practice. He knew that being able to wield a weapon that wasn't sharp and dangerous was a powerful psychological advantage. Think about it: if you're up against an opponent who is wielding a real sword, and you're only using a wooden one, the pressure on you to land a solid strike increases. The very fact that Musashi was willing to go into a duel with a wooden weapon sent a message to his opponents. It told them that he was so confident in his skill, his strategy, and his mental game that he didn't need a lethal weapon to win. This psychological element was key. Musashi's use of wooden weapons also helped him master distance. In any fight, the way you control space is just as important as the blows you land. When you're using a wooden weapon, you learn quickly that the right amount of distance can make all the difference between landing a solid strike and missing entirely. With a real sword, you may focus more on just making contact. But with wood, it becomes about setting up your opponent, getting them to move how you want, and capitalizing on their mistakes. This mastery of distance, timing, and movement is what gave Musashi an edge. And here's another thing: using wooden weapons forced Musashi to adapt to different fighting styles. Since wooden weapons were less predictable in their strikes than real swords, he had to constantly adjust his approach. Every encounter was a chance to test his ability to react, improvise, and adapt on the fly. The ability to make quick decisions, to stay fluid and flexible in your thinking, is what separates a good fighter from a great one. And Musashi was a great one, precisely because he used every training tool at his disposal, including wooden weapons, to become more versatile and unpredictable in his duels. In the end, Musashi's use of wooden weapons wasn't about choosing them for their simplicity. It was about using them as a way to elevate his combat skills to an entirely different level. Wooden weapons stripped away the distractions and allowed him to focus on what mattered most: the mind, the strategy, and the ability to outthink and outmaneuver his opponent. It was this ability to fight, not just with his body, but with his mind, that allowed Musashi to remain undefeated for so long. Reason number 9, unique two-sword fighting style. One of the most fascinating aspects of Miyamoto Musashi's unparalleled success in duels was his unique two-sword fighting style, something that set him apart from nearly everyone else in the world of swordsmanship. While most warriors focused on mastering one sword, Musashi saw the potential in wielding two, and in doing so, he unlocked a whole new level of combat that others simply couldn't match. But this wasn't just about carrying an extra sword. It was about using both blades in a way that completely altered the dynamics of a fight. First, let's think about the logic behind Musashi's choice. Two swords seem like a bit much, right? The average fighter with one sword can already be a formidable force. But Musashi wasn't interested in average. By holding a sword in each hand, he essentially doubled his offensive capabilities. But what made it unique wasn't just that he had two blades, it was how he used them. Musashi didn't treat the two swords as separate entities. Instead, he fused them into a singular, flowing system of movement that made him incredibly hard to predict. One of the main advantages of using two swords was the constant offensive pressure it put on his opponents. With his main sword in his dominant hand, Musashi could deliver powerful, decisive strikes. But with the other sword in his offhand, he could defend or strike in the same fluid motion. It wasn't the typical defense where you block, then reset, then strike. It was all happening in one continuous flow. His opponents, used to the predictable rhythm of single-sword combat, would struggle to adjust. Musashi's attacks came from all angles, almost like he was everywhere at once, and his opponents had to constantly keep track of both blades, which, frankly, was exhausting. But Musashi didn't just use his second sword for offense or defense, he used it to manipulate the fight. You see, in a standard duel, most of the action revolves around the center line, the imaginary line running down the middle of both fighters that is critical to control. A single sword gives you limited options for attacking or defending along this line. But with two blades, Musashi could dominate that space in a way that no one could match. He could threaten multiple angles at once, keeping his opponent off balance, unable to safely attack without risking an immediate counterstrike. There was also a mental aspect to this style of fighting. Imagine being an opponent, watching Musashi wield not one but two blades, both of them constantly moving. It would be difficult not to feel overwhelmed, even before the first strike was made. The psychological impact of fighting someone who seemed to be in multiple places at once was enormous. Musashi's opponents were forced to process more information than they were used to, and that split-second delay in their decision-making often made all the difference. It was as though Musashi wasn't just fighting his opponent physically, he was fighting their ability to think clearly. Another key part of Musashi's two-sword style was how it allowed him to control distance in ways that were almost invisible. In many duels, the space between fighters is just as important as the strike itself. Too close, and you risk being countered; too far, and you leave yourself vulnerable. Musashi used his two swords to manipulate that space. His offhand sword could reach out and control the distance, making it easier to create openings for his main sword to strike. He could threaten one area, force his opponent to react, and then, in the blink of an eye, switch the focus to another. This kind of fluidity made it almost impossible for his opponents to predict where he was going next. Now, you might be thinking, okay, that's great, but didn't carrying two swords slow him down? Wouldn't it make his movements less precise? Not in Musashi's case. He didn't see the two-sword style as cumbersome. In fact, it was the opposite. He developed his technique to be so precise and so fast that he could switch between defense and offense in an instant. His second sword wasn't a crutch, it was a weapon in its own right. With his offhand, he could parry an attack, deflect a blade, and instantly launch his own counterattack. He was moving in a way that was unpredictable, fast, and deliberate, something that comes from years of perfecting a system, not just picking up extra weapons for show. But what really made Musashi's two-sword style stand out was how it was a true reflection of his philosophy of combat. It wasn't about showing off or complicating things unnecessarily, it was about simplifying the fight in a way that overwhelmed his opponents. Musashi's two-sword style was just one more example of how he was always thinking 2 steps ahead. He didn't just want to be better at sword fighting, he wanted to redefine what was possible in a duel. In the end, Musashi's unique two-sword fighting style wasn't just a technical advantage, it was an extension of his mind. Every move, every strike, every adjustment to distance, all came from a deep understanding of combat. And that's why it was so effective. It wasn't just about the swords, it was about how Musashi used them in ways no one else could. His style wasn't just new, it was revolutionary. And it's one of the main reasons he never lost a duel. Reason number 10, philosophy and Zen-like focus. Miyamoto Musashi wasn't just a swordsman, he was a philosopher, and his philosophy was deeply tied to his approach to combat. It wasn't about sheer physicality for him, it was about the mindset, the mental discipline, and the way he saw the world. Musashi's thinking wasn't just about mastering the sword, it was about mastering himself. He approached every fight as more of a spiritual practice, where his mental clarity and calm were just as important as his physical skills. This Zen-like focus allowed him to move through battles with a level of serenity that others simply couldn't understand, let alone replicate. For Musashi, every duel was a test of more than just swordsmanship, it was a test of inner peace. While his opponents might be caught up in the heat of the moment, battling nerves and adrenaline, Musashi was already several steps ahead in his mind. He had this quiet, unwavering focus that allowed him to remain calm no matter how chaotic the situation became. It wasn't just about controlling his emotions, it was about letting go of them entirely. He understood that emotions, fear, anger, frustration, could cloud judgment and throw off timing. And so, he trained himself to be present, to be in the moment, without being distracted by the noise of the world around him. This Zen-like state wasn't something Musashi stumbled upon by accident. It was something he actively cultivated through years of introspection and rigorous mental training. To him, the sword wasn't just a tool, it was an extension of his mind, and his mind had to be as sharp and as clear as the blade. He didn't need to constantly rehearse movements or strategies in the heat of battle, those were already ingrained in him. What he needed to do was stay calm, centered, and aware of everything happening in the moment, so that when an opportunity arose, he could seize it with precision. Musashi's philosophy extended beyond just the fight. It shaped how he approached life as a whole. He understood that every action, every decision, rippled outward and had consequences. He took that awareness with him in everything he did, not just with the sword. He learned to stay adaptable, to see every moment as an opportunity to grow, to improve. His philosophy was rooted in the belief that mastery wasn't about perfection, but about constant refinement. Every duel, every opponent, was just another way for him to challenge himself, to grow, to become better. It wasn't just about being calm under pressure, though. Musashi's philosophy also had a deep connection to the concept of detachment. When you detach yourself from fear, from expectations, from the outcome of the fight, you free yourself to make decisions from a place of clarity. If you're not attached to winning or losing, you can make choices that others might hesitate to make. Musashi was never bogged down by the fear of failure or the desire for glory. His focus was solely on what needed to be done in the moment, nothing more, nothing less. In a duel, this detachment was incredibly powerful. While his opponents might be focused on defeating him, Musashi wasn't concerned with defeating them. He didn't approach the fight with the mindset of a conqueror. He approached it as a necessary step in his journey. His focus was purely on the present moment, the distance, the timing, the rhythm of the fight. This allowed him to stay fluid, to move and react without hesitation, and to think several steps ahead without the weight of expectation. What's more, this philosophy was not just a mental trick, it was a way of life. Musashi didn't separate his spiritual practices from his martial ones. His discipline in the dojo was mirrored by his discipline in his daily life. The mental toughness he developed through years of philosophical study and introspection translated directly into the way he approached sword fighting. It wasn't about raw power or superior technique, it was about an understanding of the world, of himself, and of his opponent that allowed him to stay ahead of the curve. When you combine all of this, the clarity, the detachment, the focus, it's easy to see why Musashi never lost a duel. His mind was so clear, his purpose so defined, that the chaos of battle never had the chance to overwhelm him. In fact, it was the chaos of battle that others struggled with. But Musashi embraced it, welcomed it, and used it to his advantage. His philosophy and Zen-like focus weren't just abstract ideas, they were the very foundation of his unbeatable swordsmanship. It wasn't just about being a warrior, it was about being a warrior at peace, and that's exactly what made him so dangerous. Thanks for watching. I hope you've gained some valuable lessons from Musashi's undefeated record in duels, lessons in strategy, mental toughness, and the art of preparation. Musashi didn't just rely on his skills, but on his mindset and ability to read any situation. These are traits that can help us conquer any challenge in life. If you found this video insightful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the strategies that lead to success. Remember, it's not just about winning the fight, it's about being prepared and staying disciplined every step of the way. Until next time, keep your mind sharp, your actions deliberate, and never stop striving for mastery. Take care.